Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com. Let's talk boxing. What attracts me to boxing more than anything else are the fighters themselves. I follow a lot of sports, but no sport has more interesting athletes than the sport of boxing, right? It's commonplace in boxing to see a great fighter who has served prison time, right? It's commonplace in boxing to see a great fighter who literally was homeless for part of their lives. We really don't know much about these fighters, right? Until the fighters tell us what they're thinking. Now, there is a dazzling piece on a great website, boxingnews24.com, that I would never have predicted. The piece quotes Carl Froch as saying that he's disappointed that he's not getting enough recognition for what he has done. And what makes the piece even more striking is he actually names several fighters who he believes he has done at least as much as, and who he believes are getting more recognition. Now, for those looking for the piece, I actually have posted a link to the article on DwyerBoxingGame.com. Again, that's DwyerBoxingGame.com. Dwyer spelled D-W-Y-E-R. The fighters who Carl Froch feels he deserves at least as much recognition as are Joe Calzaghe, Chris Eubank, Nigel Benn, Steve Collins, who beat Eubank and Nigel Benn twice each, Ricky Hatton, Nassim Hamed, and David Haye. Now, let me just respond with a few thoughts, and let's just talk about it, because really the real action in boxing is really in the personalities, the pre-fight, listening to the fighters, the pre-fight activities, the weigh-in, the walk to the ring. The match itself, if we're lucky, might have 36 minutes, 12 rounds of action, right? But really, boxing is really more about the personalities than the actual action, right? As the people waiting anxiously for Haye versus Chisora know well. Well, let me just respond to Carl Froch's concerns. First, let me say this. Carl Froch is still fighting. Right now, he's in the eye of the tornado, right? He really doesn't know. Since he's on a pedestal, since he's living the sheltered lives that boxers live, he doesn't really know what fight fans think about him. And I believe that he is highly regarded. I think he's just in a center of a tornado where if he just could move left or right, he would see that there is a lot of fan excitement about him. That crowd in Nottingham for his Lucien Boutte fight was certainly excited for Carl Froch, right? I just think that people love you more when you're retired, right? Each of the fighters on his list, including David Haye, has retired at least once, right? And let me just say that I believe Froch is more loved today than he realizes. More importantly, I believe 20 years from now, when Carl Froch shows up as an observer or a celebrity ringside for a big fight, I believe there are going to be fans in the stands who look at him and remember his wars, remember his fights against people like Mikhail Kessler, Jermaine Taylor, Andre Ward, Glenn Johnson, right? I believe Carl Froch has the reputation right now of being a fighter who takes on all comers. Now, maybe as he trains for fights and shows up at press conferences, maybe he doesn't fully grasp the fact that he is iconic. But he truly is iconic. I would argue that 20 years from now, he's going to be as highly regarded as many of the names on the list. Right? Let me also point out, too, that many of the names on the list weren't as highly regarded during their careers as they were after the fact. For example, Steve Collins, all I can say is now we can look back and we can say, wow, Steve Collins accomplished all of that, right? But when Steve Collins ruled the roost, right, he himself had a hard time getting big fights. In fact, he never fought Roy Jones Jr., right? And so, I think Carl right now is undervaluing his own reputation because, quite frankly, he's busy preparing for fights, being in the ring. I don't think he's as able to go to the local pub and interact with sports fans and go to the casino and interact with sports fans the way he will when he's retired. I also feel that, as Lennox Lewis found out, when you retire, even a lot of guys who are skeptics when you had a career will come up to you after you finished your career and say, man, you're one of my heroes. That's the first point. The second point is, I think, one of the profound things in boxing. It is not just who you beat, but it's what they do after you beat them. And I believe here, Carl Froch is still a work in progress. And by this I mean, take Lennox Lewis, who I mentioned earlier. I would argue that the most meaningful fight that Lennox Lewis ever had in his entire career, for legacy purposes, was his fight against Vitaly Klitschko. Now, at the time the fight took place, that fight wasn't even pay-per-view here in the United States. Right? I mean, the fight took place in Los Angeles, if I recall correctly. I turned on my TV and there was the fight. I didn't have to pay anything for it. People out here hardly knew who Vitaly Klitschko was at the time. I would argue this fight's more meaningful than Lewis-Tyson, where everyone knew Tyson was past his prime. Here, Lewis, in his last fight, fights Vitaly Klitschko. And fortunately for Lewis, Vitaly got cut in the fight. But my point to you is simply, because Vitaly Klitschko, after that fight, went on to several years of heavyweight dominance. I mean, literally, is champ, retires, come back, is champ again, stops guys. When you talk about the last 10 years of heavyweight boxing, Vitaly Klitschko's name has to be mentioned. Right? I would say that every time Vitaly Klitschko goes out there and does something great, it helps Lennox Lewis's legacy. Right? Now, I believe Froch has a problem here. Because take the guys Froch has beaten. Jermaine Taylor really hasn't done a lot after losing to Carl Froch. In fact, I would argue that Jermaine Taylor was clearly on the way down when he fought Froch, right? Taylor had already lost to Kelly Pavlik. Even I took Carl Froch in that fight against Jermaine Taylor, right? Glenn Johnson's career is winding down, right? Glenn Johnson is not going to go on to have the years of dominance that Vitaly Klitschko has had, right? Lucien Boutte, the book on Boutte is still being written. But my point to you is right now, if Boutte loses the rematch against Carl Froch, Boutte won't go on to the years of dominance that someone like Vitaly Klitschko did. And so Froch's reputation won't grow. Now, it's because of this boxing truism that when we judge legacy, we see not only who you beat, but what they did after you beat them. It's for that reason why, in my opinion, Carl Froch will never match Joe Calzaghe's legacy. And let's face it, of all the names here on the list, I believe the top name that gets in the back of Carl Froch's neck is Joe Calzaghe. And the problem Froch is going to have is their biggest common opponent, Mikkel Kessler, was unbeaten when Joe Calzaghe beat him. Then Mikkel Kessler went on to years of great fights. Then Kessler fights Froch and beats Froch. So I think that a lot of fans are going to look at it and say, well, Joe Calzaghe, unbeaten, fought Mikkel Kessler and beat Kessler in his prime when Kessler was unbeaten. Whereas Carl Froch fought Kessler after some wear and tear, after Kessler lost to Andre Ward, right, who also beat Carl Froch. And of course, there, the fight was close, but the judges went with Kessler. I think Froch is hurt by that comparison. Both the timing, Kessler's unbeaten here, Kessler has a recent loss when he fights Carl Froch, as well as the fact that, you know, Kessler actually beat a bunch of guys after he lost to Joe Calzaghe. That's the first one. The second one is the Bernard Hopkins factor, right? Joe Calzaghe fought Hopkins. Bernard Hopkins obviously was no longer a middleweight where he was dominant, right? But Calzaghe beats Hopkins, who then goes on after that fight to beat Kelly Pavlik and then to beat Jean Pascal to become the oldest champion in history, right? You know, just like Vitaly Klitschko went on after the Lennox Lewis fight, did some great things, and that shined back a great reflection on Lewis. The fact that Bernard Hopkins is still viewed as an effective fighter post-Calzaghe actually helps the Calzaghe legacy. It's even worse than that. The idea that, you know, Hopkins is still fighting, as recently as his most recent fight to Chad Dawson, Hopkins was actually the light heavyweight champion at a time when Froch, a contemporary of Hopkins, was actually fighting at a lighter weight class. If you add up and chart all the weight classes, that makes Calzaghe look even more impressive. Let me also say, too, in my opinion, the best fighter of the 1990s was Roy Jones Jr. Now, Roy Jones today isn't who Roy Jones was back then, right? But I will say this. Joe Calzaghe beat Roy Jones. I think that's major as well, because guys like Steve Collins never got the opportunity to fight Roy Jones. Joe Calzaghe even has that on his resume. And while today we can say, well, Roy Jones was faded at the time, right? Just understand, in history, Roy Jones is still going to be considered one of the best fighters of this era. So there again, you know, and keep in mind, too, that Calzaghe beat Jones before Jones went on to lose a bunch of subsequent fights. I understand he had already lost to the Road Warrior Glenn Johnson. I understand he had already lost to Antonio Tarver. But the Roy Jones who lost to Calzaghe was a bit better than current Roy Jones. I think that's another feather in Calzaghe's hat. So to sum it all up, I would say that Carl Froch is underrating his own legacy right now. But at the same time, Carl Froch's legacy will never match, unfortunately, Joe Calzaghe's legacy, right? When Calzaghe ruled the roost, here in the States, we always ask the question of when he was going to fight somebody, right? I believe he cleaned that up in his last two fights by beating Bernard Hopkins and Roy Jones. When you add in the fact that he beat an unbeaten Mikhail Kessler, and he beat, granted, an overrated but a favored unbeaten fighter, Jeff Lacey, and when you factor in the fact that Joe Calzaghe also beat one of the fighters Carl Froch has on his list, Chris Eubank, right? I think we really have to recognize the fact that Carl Froch is chasing a ghost in Joe Calzaghe that he can't catch, right? Calzaghe will always be an unbeaten fighter, assuming he doesn't do the boxing thing of making a comeback several years from now. Let's talk about some of the other names. All I can say is, in boxing, it's very hard to be an original. And, whatever we want to say about Prince Naseem Hamed, I'll just say Hamed might be the hardest puncher I have ever seen in any weight class. This guy was the definition of one-punch knockout power. And, of course, he was a guy who, quite frankly, did it with style. I know many people are going to talk about the Marco Antonio Barrera fight. I can't understand how one fight against one opponent could go so far toward creating such skepticism about the fighter. But let me just say this, as great as Carl Froch is, he doesn't have that signature trait that a Naseem Hamed has. Froch is a hard puncher, don't get me wrong. But I believe Prince Naseem Hamed was a historical puncher. I would encourage everyone to look at the films of Hamed. Okay, it's not just personality and flavor, it's actually what the guy did in the ring. Let me also say this too about David Haye. Life is unfair. You want to know who the baddest man on the planet is? When I was growing up in the 70s, we knew it was the heavyweight champion of the world. These other divisions, hey, maybe they have better fighters pound for pound, right? Maybe they do. But when you say heavyweight champion, for some of us, that just carries a little bit more weight. Now, I'm not here to say David Haye has done more than Carl Froch has in the ring. Although an argument can be made. If you look at Haye's full body of work, he was the unified cruiserweight champion of the world. And then let's remember, to become heavyweight champion, he actually had to go on foreign soil. He went on foreign soil, and he did that, right? And, of course, let's remember in other Haye fights, guys hit the canvas multiple times. Monty Barrett, I believe, hit the canvas something like 4 or 5 times, right? So, whatever happens this weekend in the Haye Chisora matchup, all I will say is, if I talk with most fans, I believe if there's a division that they know the champions of, going back generations, that would be the heavyweight division, right? People, I get emails from people talking about Jack Johnson, Jack Dempsey, Joe Louis. Think about it. Joe Louis is back several years, right? Ali, Sonny Liston, George Foreman, Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali, Riddick Bowe, Lennox Lewis, right? My point to you is heavyweights always get the spotlight. So I hope that, Carl Froch isn't comparing himself to heavyweights because rightly or wrongly, this is boxing and, the king of the world is the heavyweight champion in this part of the world. Food for thought. So, Haye was a heavyweight champion. I'll just say, as we remember this period, the Klitschko period, we're going to remember David Haye's challenge of the Klitschkos and David Haye's, ascension to the top of the heavyweight division, whether or not Haye has been in more barn burner fights than people in the super middleweight division. I'm not saying it's fair, All I'm saying is ask yourself, does any division in boxing matter historically as much as the heavyweight division? You know, Archie Moore, dominant light heavyweight, no question about it. I would say that more people today probably know Sonny Liston, who had the belt for about 2 minutes, than they know Archie Moore. I could be wrong. You let me know. Leave your comments for me here online. I hope you visit us at Gamblers Advisory and DwyerBoxingGame.com. It's a great article on Carl Froch. I thoroughly recommend it. It's at BoxingNews24.com. I have the link up at DwyerBoxingGame.com. Let's talk boxing. Thanks for watching.